So you want to buy an island, and here's what you're picturing. A boat pulls up to a white sand beach. You step off in linen pants, and for the rest of your life, nobody tells you what to do again. Here's what actually happens. You've just bought a piece of land with no power grid, no water supply, no roads, no hospital, no fire department, and in most cases, no legal jurisdiction that particularly likes you. You haven't bought a paradise, you've bought a startup, a very wet, very expensive startup where the product is you, and the only customer is also you. Let's break down what buying an island actually costs, how the ultra-rich turn a rock in the ocean into a revenue machine, why one of history's most infamous private islands became a case study in exactly how fast this can go wrong, and what nobody tells you before you sign the deed. Hey guys, my name is Leo, and today I'll show you the stupid rich math on the economics of owning a private island. The average American hears the word private island and thinks it's cheap. Like, surely a whole island costs less than a Manhattan apartment, right? Wrong. But also kind of right, and that's the trap. Jeffrey Epstein bought Little St. James in 1998 for $7.95 million. Richard Branson bought Necker Island in the British Virgin Islands in 1978 for $180,000. That's less than a decent house in most US suburbs today. Larry Ellison bought 98% of the Hawaiian island of Lanai, 90,000 acres, in 2012 for $300 million. Are you noticing the range? $180,000 to $300 million for the exact same category of purchase, an island. The land price is basically meaningless on its own. What actually determines the bill is what happens after you sign. Because here's the part the fantasy skips. An island has no infrastructure. You are now personally responsible for building a functioning micronation from scratch in the middle of open water, where every single system, power, water, waste, transport, costs 2 to 3 times more than it would on the mainland, because everything has to be shipped in. Branson didn't stop at $180,000. He spent an additional $10 million over 3 years just to make Necker livable. Ellison didn't stop at $300 million. He committed to spending up to $500 million more on infrastructure, and separately spent an estimated $450 million remodeling a single resort on the island. So the real formula for buying an island isn't purchase price. It's purchase price roughly 3 to 5 times more before you've spent a single night sleeping there comfortably. Before we even get to construction, there's a detail most people skip entirely. In a huge number of cases, you don't actually own the island. You lease it. Marlon Brando fell in love with the atoll of Tetiaroa in French Polynesia. While filming a movie there in 1962, he didn't buy it outright. Instead, he negotiated a 99-year lease in 1966, giving him exclusive development rights over 2 of its 12 small islets. That's it. Not the ocean floor, not the reef, not the other 10 islets. A 99-year lease on 2 pieces of sand, and it still took him years of negotiation to get it. This is more common than people assume, because most island nations restrict full freehold ownership by foreigners entirely. What you're actually buying in a lot of cases is a long-term lease dressed up in the language of ownership, which matters enormously for resale value, inheritance planning, and what happens to your investment when the lease clock runs out. And then there's the discretion layer. Almost nobody buys an island under their own name. Jeffrey Epstein purchased Little St. James through a shell company called LSJ LLC, with himself listed as the sole member, which is a structure used specifically to keep the transaction off the public record under his own name. This is standard practice among ultra-high net worth buyers. Islands get purchased through LLCs, trusts, and holding companies for tax positioning, liability shielding, and privacy, not necessarily because anyone's hiding something. But it does mean that a huge share of the private island economy is legally invisible until a lawsuit, a divorce, or a federal indictment drags the paperwork into daylight. So step 1 of buying an island isn't picking a beach. It's deciding whether you're buying land, leasing land, or buying a company that owns land, and each of those has a completely different exit strategy. The tax picture shifts depending on which route you take too. A freehold purchase in a low-tax jurisdiction like the British Virgin Islands can mean minimal ongoing property taxation compared to a mainland American estate of equivalent value. which is part of why so many of these islands cluster in the Caribbean and the Pacific, rather than, say, off the coast of New Jersey. But that same low-tax environment usually comes paired with weaker legal protections if a dispute ever goes to court, and with foreign ownership restrictions that can cap you at a minority stake or a lease rather than outright title. There is no version of this transaction where you get maximum privacy, maximum ownership rights and minimum tax exposure all at once. You're always trading one against the other too, and the paperwork you sign on day one locks in that trade for the life of the asset. Let's get into the actual line items, because this is where the fantasy dies fastest, as islands don't have fresh waters, so you need a desalination plant, which runs anywhere from $30,000 to over $400,000 to install, plus up to $15,000 a year just to keep it running. And you need filters, pumps, constant maintenance, because saltwater destroys machinery on a schedule. No power grid means you're building your own solar, diesel backup, or both maybe, and that alone runs $50,000 to $200,000, with 2 to 5% of that value in required upkeep every single year, until you own that Islam, because salt air corrodes everything twice as fast. You also need docks, airstrips and helipads, because boats and planes are now your only way in or out of your own house. $75,000 and up for a dock alone, and again annual repairs, because the ocean does not respect your investment. Quite insane and apathetic, right? Brando's team built a full private airstrip on Tetiaroa just to get guests there without damaging the surrounding reef with boat traffic, and an entire runway before a single villa was finished. Obviously, you direly need staff. Necker Island runs on a team of roughly 100 people containing chefs, groundskeepers, security, boat crews, because paradise doesn't clean itself. The Brando Resort on Tetiaroa runs on roughly 300 staff and facilities personnel for just 36 villas, which tells you something important. On an island, your staff-to-guest ratio isn't a luxury flex, but it's a logistical necessity. Of course, you can get my point, because there's no outside vendor to call when something breaks. Whereas Ellison's Island came bundled with 2 Four Seasons resorts, which means he didn't just buy land. He bought an entire employer relationship with 3,000 residents. And then there's the number that actually breaks people. Total annual maintenance on a developed private island typically runs 3 to 10% of the island's total value every single year. On a $100 million island, that's $3 to $10 million a year just to keep the lights on, before you've had a single guest and before you've made a single dollar back. You didn't buy real estate. You bought a permanent, unrelenting subscription service, and the ocean is the one billing you. Now here's where it gets interesting, because the smartest owners don't treat the island as a toy. They treat it as an asset class, and they build a business on top of the rock. Take Branson's model. Necker Island isn't just his house. It operates as a full commercial hospitality asset under the Virgin Limited Edition brand. Private buyouts of the entire island start around $100,000 a night and frequently exceed $1 million a week. Individual rooms, when available, start at over $5,000 a night for a property with roughly 24 rooms across the island. Run the math conservatively. Even at partial occupancy across a year, an island generating 6 figures per night of actual bookings can plausibly clear 8 figures in annual revenue, call it $10 to $20 million a year on a good booking calendar. Against an original $180,000 purchase price, plus a low 8-figure build-out, that's not a vanity purchase anymore. That's one of the highest return on investment assets a billionaire can hold, because scarcity is the entire product. There are only so many private islands on Earth, and demand for exactly this kind of privacy is growing at roughly 8% a year according to island brokerage data, with 1 in 5 global island inquiries now coming from Americans specifically. Brando's estate followed a similar playbook after decades of his death. The Brando Resort opened in 2014 with villas starting around $11,000 a night. And today, rates on Tetiaroa range from roughly $4,000 a night for a standard villa up to over $24,000 a night for the top residents, and the guest list alone functions as marketing you couldn't buy at any price. Barack Obama wrote his memoir there, and the property has hosted names like Beyoncé, Jay-Z, and Leonardo DiCaprio. That's a 99-year lease on 2 motors. generating a permanent luxury income stream almost 60 years after the ink-dried proof that even when you don't technically own the land, the brand built on top of it can still be the real asset. On the other hand, there is another way which Ellison took instead of renting out privacy. He bought an existing tourism economy outright. His $300 million purchase came bundled with 2 operating Four Seasons resorts, already generating guest revenue, positioning him less as an island owner and more as the landlord, employer, and sole commercial entity for an entire local economy. His investment, originally valued at $300 million in 2012, it is now estimated at $1.2 billion, a nearly fourfold increase in just over a decade, without counting a single dollar of resort income. So there are 3 real playbooks here. First one is rent out the fantasy like Branson, and your island becomes a cash-flowing hospitality brand. Secondly, you can lease the land and build the brand anyway like Brando's estate, and you get luxury income without ever holding the deed. And the third one is you can buy the whole local economy like Ellison, and your island becomes a long-term appreciating asset with a captive customer base. Either way, the island stops being a purchase and starts being a portfolio position, and that's the actual reason billionaires keep buying them. What none of these 3 playbooks change is the ceiling on how fast that revenue actually arrives. A hotel chain can open 40 properties in a year if the capital is there, but an island can't. You are capped by a fixed number of rooms, a fixed number of flights in and out, and a fixed number of nights in a calendar year, which means even at Branson-level pricing, there's a hard limit on how much revenue a single island can generate, no matter how much demand exists on the other side of that scarcity. The upside isn't unlimited. It's a very expensive, very exclusive, very small business with a permanent ceiling built into its own geography. But privacy is a double-edged asset. The same isolation that makes an island valuable is exactly what makes it dangerous, because nobody's watching what happens there until they are. Jeffrey Epstein bought Little St. James in 1998 and later added the neighboring Great St. James Island for $22.5 million in 2016. They make $30.45 million in total. For over 2 decades, the island operated as private, self-contained, invisible from the outside, and it held through a shell company instead of his own name. Then Epstein was arrested on federal trafficking charges in 2019, and everything the island's privacy had been protecting became the center of a criminal and civil investigation instead. By 2019, the island's estimated value had climbed to $63.8 million, more than 8 times what Epstein paid for it. But after his death and the criminal fallout, his estate tried to sell both islands for $125 million in 2022. They sat on the market for over a year, and the buyers stayed away. The eventual sale price in 2023 was $60 million, less than half the original asking price, a 52% discount driven purely by reputational toxicity. Under the estate's broader legal settlement, roughly $30 million of that sale went directly to a victims fund, out of a total $105 million settlement with the U.S. Virgin Islands government. That's the lesson hiding inside this scandal. From a pure asset management standpoint, privacy is valuable right up until it becomes evidence. An island can appreciate 8 times over in 2 decades and still lose more than half its market value in 18 months, the moment its owner's reputation collapses. The land didn't change, the water didn't change. The only thing that changed was what the world now associated with the name on the deed, and the market repriced it instantly. Even the buyer who eventually stepped in got a discount specifically because he was buying a stigma along with the sand, and he's still working years later to turn that stigma back into a functioning resort. Beyond reputation, there are physical and structural threats that brochures conveniently leave out. Hurricanes aren't hypothetical, they're a recurring line item. Necker Island was destroyed by fire in 2011, then hit directly by Category 5 Hurricane Irma in 2017, requiring a full multi-million-dollar rebuild. Standard hurricane insurance in exposed coastal zones carries deductibles of 1 to 10% of a property's insured value, meaning on a $50 million island estate, you could personally absorb up to $5 million in damage before insurance even activates. And that's before accounting for the average American hurricane insurance premium environment, where flood and wind coverage alone routinely run into the thousands of dollars annually. Even on a modest mainland home scale, that up to an entire private compound sitting directly in open water, and the multiplier is severe. Then there's jurisdiction risk. Buying an island doesn't buy you out of government, it just changes which government and how much leverage you have with it. Regulatory renewals, environmental compliance, coastal permits, and local labor law all still apply, and non-compliance costs stack on top of maintenance costs, not instead of them. Even Brando's estate ended up in a multi-year legal dispute with a local activist over environmental damage claims, a fight that only ended with an undisclosed settlement after 2 separate court rulings. And there's liquidity risk, which is the quiet killer. Islands are among the least liquid assets in the world. When Epstein's estate tried to sell, it took over a year and a 52% discount to find a buyer, and that's without factoring in how much the scandal itself suppressed the price. Industry data suggests normal, unscandalized private islands can still sit on the market for years simply because the buyer pool is so small. Try selling a $50 million mansion, and you'll get offers within weeks. Try selling a $50 million private island, and you might get offers within years. You're not buying a house. You're buying an asset with almost no buyer pool, in a market where only a few hundred people on Earth can even afford to bid. Add it up, and the risk profile looks less like real estate and more like owning a small, undiversified, highly illiquid company, one where you're simultaneously the founder, the sole investor, and, if anything goes wrong, the headline. There's also a threat that's less dramatic but more expensive over time: depreciation of the systems themselves. A mainland house sits on infrastructure that a city maintains for you: public water lines, a public grid, roads someone else repaves. An island has none of that safety net, which means every system you installed on day one is also quietly aging on day one, with no shared cost base to soften the bill. Desalination membranes need replacing roughly every 5 to 10 years. Solar arrays and diesel backups degrade faster in salt air than anywhere else on the planet. Docks and airstrips face constant erosion. None of this shows up as a single dramatic loss. The way a hurricane does, it shows up as a slow, compounding tax on the asset that never stops accruing for as long as you own it. So here's the actual stupid rich math of owning a private island. You pay millions for the land, or you don't even get the land at all. You get a 99-year lease with your name nowhere on it. You spend 3 to 5 times the purchase price to make it livable. 3 to 10% of its total value every single year just to maintain it. And in exchange, you get total privacy and assets so illiquid it can take years to sell, so exposed it can be leveled by a single storm, and so scandal-sensitive that the wrong headline can erase half its value overnight. At the end of this video, I encourage you all to tell me on which thing you want me to do a stupid rich math, and what do you think to own, and how it will make your rich math more richer than ever. Tell me in the comments. I'll make the whole video for you.